Some stories aren't told, not because they are forgotten, but because they remember you when you speak them. There was once a place in Tennessee, not on any map you can find now. The trees have taken it back, but if you walk far enough into those hills, you can still feel where it was. The ground there, it hums. In the winter of 1902, in a single-room cabin of warped cedar boards, two lives entered the world side by side. No one wrote the hour of their birth. No one blessed them at the altar. And yet, from the first moment, they seemed to carry an understanding that no prayer could reach. The midwife swore she heard them breathe in unison, as though they shared a single set of lungs. When she lifted them to the firelight, their eyes were already open, not the cloudy eyes of newborns, but sharp, deliberate, as if they were taking inventory of every shadow in the room. That night, the wind died, not slowed, died. The dogs lay silent, the forest held its breath, and inside that cabin, their mother whispered something no one repeated, not even in old age. By morning, the neighbors avoided the path to the house. Horses balked, cattle pulled away, and even the birds altered their flight over that patch of land. The father stayed inside for 3 days. When he finally emerged, his beard had gone white. No one dared to call it a curse. No one dared to call it a blessing. But they all knew something had arrived that did not belong to the sequence of ordinary life. Something that had been waiting. If you keep listening, I'll tell you how the twins began to shape the minds around them without a single word, and why the people who survived what followed would later insist, in hushed, trembling voices, that the day of their birth was not the beginning but the return. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, a circle of ground where grass never grew, even in spring. People noticed it long before the twins were born, but after that winter, no one crossed it without reason. Those who did spoke less afterward. For the first month of their lives, the twins made no sound. They did not cry, did not fuss, and their eyes tracked the movements of anyone who entered the room. The mother insisted they spoke to her in dreams, not with voices, but with images, shapes, places, faces she had never seen, yet recognized when she woke. One night she told her sister that the children had shown her the river that would flood in spring, the barn that would burn before summer, and the grave that would be dug before autumn leaves fell. All three happened exactly as she described. Rumors spread, quiet at first, then louder in the way whispers gather weight. The doctor who delivered them packed his bags and left town without explanation. A neighbor, Henry Cale, claimed that as he passed the cabin one morning, he saw both infants staring out the window at him, their heads moving together, their eyes locking with his, until he forgot why he had come. He moved away 2 weeks later. And then there were the nights. The mother would wake to find them both sitting upright in their crib, eyes wide open in the dark, facing the same direction, toward the door. The father began sleeping with a Bible under his pillow. The first undeniable sign came in early March. The twins were barely 3 months old when the preacher's wife visited with a basket of bread. Before she could knock, the mother opened the door and said, "You should not go to your brother's farm tomorrow. The ground will not hold him." The woman froze. She had not told a soul she planned to visit her brother. The next day, a sinkhole swallowed half the field behind his barn. He survived, but only because his wife had kept him inside. After that, people stopped asking questions, and the clearing around the cabin grew wider. By the time the twins could walk, the cabin had become the center of something unspoken. People avoided it by daylight but could not keep away at night. They came quietly, one at a time, as though ashamed to be seen, and always left with the same hollow look in their eyes. No one admitted what they asked the twins, but rumors drifted like smoke. A lost deed recovered, an illness described in detail before it struck, a name whispered that belonged to someone already dead. The strangest part was how little the children spoke. Their words were rare, deliberate, and often incomplete, yet every person swore they understood them completely. The rest was done with silence. A gaze, a tilt of the head, the slow movement of their hands in the air, as though rearranging something unseen. By their 4th year, the town's elders noticed something else. Arguments ended when the twins entered a room. People who had been at odds for years would fall silent, stare at the floor, and speak softly until the children left. No one could explain it. No one wanted to. The preacher called it a blessing of peace. The blacksmith called it something older than peace. And then came the incident at the schoolhouse. A visiting teacher from Nashville, unfamiliar with the stories, made the mistake of scolding them for drawing strange symbols on the chalkboard during recess. She said they froze in place, staring at her without blinking, until she felt something in the air shift. A heaviness pressing against her chest. She left before the end of the week, muttering about being watched from the inside out. From that point, the twins' presence was no longer merely tolerated. It was managed. People changed their routes to avoid passing too close. The preacher began visiting them privately, returning with verses no one recognized from any Bible. And in the evenings, if you stood far enough, back from the clearing, you could see them through the window, sitting opposite each other, hands flat on the table, speaking without words. What they were planning, no one dared ask. It began with the livestock. Not the sudden deaths you might expect, but a kind of migration. Goats, mules, even stray dogs started leaving their pens at night, crossing into the clearing, and standing silently outside the cabin until dawn. Some stayed for hours, eyes fixed on the same window. Others never left at all. By then the twins were 5, and their habits had shifted. They no longer waited for visitors. They went to them, always together, always silent, their bare feet leaving no sound on the dirt paths. The first home they visited belonged to the Miller's family. No one knows what was said inside, only that the next morning the Miller stopped collecting debts owed to him and began giving away grain without payment. Within weeks his own household was nearly bankrupt, but his eyes, people said, had lost their sharpness, as if part of him had been set aside. Soon after, they appeared on the porch of the widow Palmer. She hadn't spoken to anyone in years, not since her son drowned in the river. The morning after the twins left, she was seen walking toward the riverbank, speaking softly to someone no one could see. Patterns emerged. Each family they visited began acting differently, quieter, more withdrawn. Some left the area entirely, abandoning homes without selling them. Others stayed but no longer attended church, no longer worked their fields, no longer seemed to notice the passing of seasons. The preacher kept his sermons shorter, the doctor stopped making house calls, and those who tried to confront the twins, to demand what they were doing, found themselves unable to recall their own words once the children looked at them. By summer, the clearing around the cabin was nearly twice its size. The soil where grass once grew had turned a deep, unnatural black. Crows began to gather there, perched in a ring along the tree line, silent and still, too, their eyes following the twins as they moved. It was around this time that the first disappearance occurred, and unlike the animals, the missing man was never seen again. The man's name was Elias Grady, a trapper, one of the few in the settlement who still wandered deep into the hills alone. He was last seen walking the path toward the cabin with a bundle of pelts over his shoulder. Some say he went there to sell his catch to the twins' father. Others claim he was going to settle a matter after finding strange markings carved into the trees along his trap lines. Whatever his reason, he never came back. At first, the search was thorough. Men with lanterns swept the woods, calling his name into the dark. The dogs refused to track his scent. His footprints led to the edge of the clearing and stopped. Not a single sign of struggle, not a drop of blood, just absence. The sheriff suggested he'd gone deeper into the mountains, but the locals knew better. They'd seen the twins the next morning sitting on the cabin's porch steps, each holding one of Elias's gloves. Neither spoke a word. Within a month, 2 more people vanished. A young woman named Liza Carruthers, who had been heard muttering in the market about children who stare too long, and a farmhand named Owen Briggs, whose only mistake was telling the preacher he wanted the cabin burned. Both vanished without trace. What frightened the town most wasn't just the disappearances, it was the change in those left behind. Liza's mother was seen smiling faintly at the edge of the clearing days after her daughter went missing, as though waiting for something. Owen's employer abandoned his farm altogether, leaving the animals to wander. And the twins? They began to appear further from the cabin, at the schoolhouse, by the riverbank, even in the church, sitting silently in the back pew during evening services, their eyes fixed on the pulpit until the preacher's voice faltered. No one could prove they were connected to the vanishings. No one dared accuse them outright. But at night, in whispered conversations, the words began to surface. Their choosing. The crows multiplied. The soil in the clearing spread wider, and the silence in those hills became heavier, as though the land itself knew more names than it cared to say aloud. Fear changed everything. It began subtly. Fewer lights in windows after dark, fewer children playing near the tree line. The laughter of the settlement drained away, replaced by long pauses in conversation whenever the twins were mentioned. By their 7th year, they no longer needed to visit a home to affect it. People began reporting sensations, a pressure in the chest when they walked certain roads, a feeling of being followed in an empty room, waking in the night to the distinct impression that someone was standing at the foot of the bed, but finding no one there. The preacher's wife confided to her sister that she'd begun dreaming in pairs. 2 shadows at the end of a long hallway, always watching her, always waiting for her to take a step toward them. She'd wake before she reached the end, but her feet would be wet, as though she had been standing outside in the dew. Then came the Sunday service. Halfway through the sermon, the church door creaked open. The twins entered barefoot, walking slowly down the center aisle. No one moved. The preacher stammered mid-sentence and then stopped speaking altogether. They didn't take seats. They didn't bow their heads. They stood before the pulpit, looking up at him until he stepped back without realizing it. Then, together, they turned their heads toward the congregation. People described it later as if the twins were counting, not with numbers, but with recognition. One by one, each member of the congregation felt their eyes meet theirs. Most looked away immediately, some wept quietly, and a few simply froze. When they left, no one resumed the sermon. Everyone went home. The following week, 3 families packed their wagons and left town without explanation. Their homes remained abandoned, their possessions untouched. From then on, the twins were not spoken of openly. The town adopted a code of silence. An agreement not to name them, not to question them, not to draw their attention unnecessarily. But fear has a way of feeding the thing it fears, and whatever the twins were becoming, they had only just begun. The outsider came in autumn. A man named Jonathan Hale, a surveyor from the city, sent to map the region for a proposed rail line. He was tall, quick-spoken, and carried himself like someone who believed maps could tell the truth about any land. The townsfolk warned him about the clearing. Not directly, of course. They spoke in half-sentences, changed the subject, pretended they didn't remember the routes he asked about. But Jonathan was the kind who mistook silence for superstition, and superstition for weakness. On his 2nd day, he walked into the general store with a fresh set of topographical sketches and asked loudly, "What's this empty patch here?" He tapped the paper, a perfect circle in the forest, unmarked by roads or buildings. No one answered. That evening, he went to see for himself. The clearing was larger than he'd imagined, nearly an acre of bare, blackened soil, ringed by crows. The cabin sat at its center, dark windows reflecting the gray sky. He approached with the casual confidence of a man who had never been told no by the land itself. He knocked, once, twice. The door opened. The twins stood there. Jonathan would later write in his notebook, though not in any report, that they did not blink, did not speak, did not move aside. And yet he found himself stepping inside without invitation. He could not remember crossing the threshold. When he returned to town, his sketches had changed. The empty circle was now filled with twisting lines and unfamiliar symbols. He could not explain them, but he insisted they were correct. That night, he burned the original drafts in the hearth of the boarding house. By the end of the week, Jonathan stopped asking about the rail line. He began visiting the clearing every evening, standing at its edge until the sun was gone. The townsfolk avoided him, not out of malice, but because they could no longer be sure whose side he was on. And then one morning, his bed at the boarding house was empty. His belongings remained. His boots were neatly placed by the door. The sheriff said he'd gone back to the city, but the crows in the clearing had multiplied again. It started with travelers. Merchants passing through on the Ridge Road began arriving in town later than expected, their wagons lighter than they should have been. When asked what had delayed them, they would give vague answers. A wrong turn, a stretch of bad road, just lost for a bit. But their eyes told another story. Some of them carried something invisible back with them. That same quietness the townsfolk had begun to wear. They spoke less, smiled less, and when night fell, they would stand at their inn windows and look toward the forest, as if waiting for a signal. Then came the letters. Relatives in distant towns wrote of odd changes in those who had visited here. A cousin in Fairwater who stopped attending her market stall after seeing something in the tree line. A tradesman in Dunford who gave up his business overnight and began walking the riverbanks at dusk, humming a tune no one recognized. Word of the twins began to move outward, not in the form of stories, but impressions. A shared dream here, a familiar pair of silhouettes there. People far from the hills began speaking of the children who choose, though none could explain how they knew of them. One autumn night, a peddler staying at the boarding house woke the innkeeper with a scream. He claimed he had been dreaming of the road, a road that led into the clearing, and the twins were standing in the middle of it, holding hands. They had whispered something he could not remember upon waking, but his mouth was full of dirt when the innkeeper found him. The preacher, who had once convinced himself this was a curse bound to the valley, began to suspect otherwise. Perhaps it was not the cabin that held them, but the land itself that was spreading, not in miles, but in minds. And as the crows began appearing on rooftops in neighboring towns, it became clear that whatever the twins were, they were no longer bound by the edge of the clearing. It was Mason Carter who tried. A man of broad shoulders and quick temper, Mason had lost his younger brother to the hills 2 winters before. No body, no sign, just a set of boot prints that led toward the clearing and never returned. Mason had carried that absence like a splinter under the skin, festering with each passing year. One night in early winter, after a long evening at the saloon, he announced to anyone listening that he was done living in the shadow of 2 ghost-eyed brats. He would go to the cabin before dawn and burn it to the ground. The few men who heard him said nothing. No one volunteered to join him. Just before sunrise, Mason walked into the clearing with a sack of oil-soaked rags, a lantern, and a hatchet. The air was sharp with frost, his breath curling before him. He did not knock. He went straight to the side of the cabin and smashed one of the shutters open. Inside, the house was empty. No fire, no furniture, no sign that anyone had lived there for years. The floorboards were bare, but when Mason stepped inside, the boards creaked in a way that sounded layered, as though there was something beneath them, shifting when he moved. He lit the rags, tossing them into a corner. The flames caught quickly, climbing the walls, feeding on dry wood. Mason smiled grimly, muttering something about sending his brother home in spirit. Then the smoke changed. It thickened, black and wet, clinging to his face, his hands, his lungs. It didn't sting. It chilled. He stumbled back, but the doorway was no longer where he had entered. The walls seemed longer, the angles sharper, and every window now opened onto the clearing at night, though it was still morning outside. The last thing anyone saw of Mason Carter was his lantern lying just beyond the cabin's porch, its flame guttering out in the snow. By the time a few men worked up the courage to enter, the clearing, the cabin, stood untouched. Not a mark of fire on its walls. The only sign Mason had been there was his hatchet, buried halfway into the black soil, still warm to the touch. After Mason, the town stopped pretending. They had whispered for years, traded warnings in half-sentences, avoided the clearing like it was a sickness in the soil. But now the truth was undeniable. The cabin could not be burned, the twins could not be banished, and the hills were no longer content to keep them hidden. A meeting was called in the church basement. No one rang the bell, no one posted a notice. Word simply spread. By nightfall, nearly every able-bodied man and woman in the settlement was there, sitting on the hard benches beneath the low, dripping rafters. The preacher spoke first. His voice was steady, but his eyes never lifted from the floor. "We cannot fight what they are," he said. "We cannot tear it down. But maybe we can send it away." The suggestion came from an old trapper named Ellis Ward, a man who'd lived in the valley before most of them were born. He claimed there were places deeper in the range where the land itself bent differently, places too old for the likes of us. If they could lure the twins there, the forest might swallow them whole. It was not a plan so much as a hope, but in a room full of people who had run out of both, it was enough. They decided on a gift, not one of gold or silver, but something the twins might follow. A piece of themselves they would willingly give, a lure soaked in the human weight of memory and meaning. Over the next week, the town gathered objects, a locket with a portrait inside, a child's quilt worn thin at the edges, a hunter's knife with a name carved into the bone handle. Each was placed in a rough cedar chest. The night before the attempt, Ellis went alone to the clearing to leave the chest at the cabin door. He returned pale, lips tight, but said nothing. At dawn, the chest was gone. The tracks, small, bare, and perfectly parallel, led north toward the deeper forest. The town watched the hills until they could no longer see the tree line. For a while, there was hope. For 3 weeks, the hills were quiet. The crows thinned, and the air felt lighter, as though some weight had shifted just far enough away to breathe again. Children played nearer the tree line, the boarding house filled with travelers who didn't arrive with strange silences in their eyes. The preacher even dared to speak of spring. Then one evening the chest came back. It was found in the center of the main street, resting in the dust, as if it had been set there with care. The lid was closed, but the cedar was damp, dark stains blooming across the grain. When Ellis Ward pried it open, the smell of cold earth poured out. Deep earth, like something that had been buried for centuries. The locket was there, but the portrait had been replaced with a thin square of black glass that reflected no light. The quilt was folded neatly, but its colors had bled into a muddy gray, and when touched it left a faint greasy residue on the fingers. The hunter's knife was gone, replaced with a length of bone carved in spiraling, unfamiliar runes. No one spoke, not even when they noticed the footprints in the dirt around the chest, small, bare, and in pairs, but this time there were more than 2 sets. That night the dogs would not stop barking. Windows were found open in the morning that had been locked before bed, and though no one admitted it aloud, more than one person swore they heard children laughing in the spaces between the wind. By the end of the week, 3 townsfolk were missing. It was clear now, the forest had not swallowed the twins, it had fed them. The first to return was Mary Coulson. She walked into town at dusk, barefoot, wearing the same dress she'd vanished in a week earlier. The fabric was torn, but not in the way clothing tears from brambles or falls. The cuts were precise, deliberate, as though each had been measured. Mary smiled when she saw the townsfolk gathered in the street. "I've been with them," she said, as if speaking of neighbors. "They wanted me to tell you they'll be here soon." Her voice was wrong, not in tone, but in rhythm. It carried a strange, measured cadence, like a song spoken instead of sung. Her eyes, too, seemed slightly too still. That night, Mary sat at the corner table in the boarding house, humming softly. Anyone who listened too long found themselves humming it hours later, without realizing when they'd started. The second to return was Jonah Burke, the blacksmith's son. He had always been broad and loud, quick to laugh. Now he moved slowly, deliberately, as if every motion was part of a larger pattern only he understood. His palms were covered in thin, dark lines, not scars, not ink, but something in between. He did not speak for 2 days. When he finally did, it was to say, "It's not a cabin anymore." The third was Mrs. Felder, a widow who'd kept to herself since her husband's death. She came back in the middle of the night, walking straight through the square without looking at a soul. Those who saw her swore her shadow was wrong, too tall, too thin, and lagging half a step behind. By the end of the month, the missing were all back, but they no longer felt like townsfolk. They sat together in the evenings, not speaking, not moving, watching the road that led toward the forest. And every night, just before the moon cleared the ridge, they would all turn their heads in the same direction, as if listening for something approaching. It came without footsteps. One moment the road beyond the square was empty, lit only by the silver spill of moonlight. The next, there was movement. Not the slow approach of someone walking, but the sudden presence of something already there, as though it had been standing just out of sight, waiting for its turn to be seen. The returned townsfolk rose as one. No signal was given, no word spoken, but they moved with the precision of a single body, stepping forward until they stood at the edge of the road. The rest of the town held back, pressed into the shadowed edges of porches and doorways, hearts pounding without knowing why. From the dark came 2 small shapes. The twins. They looked unchanged. Same pale faces, same tangled hair, same bare feet. But the air around them was wrong. It shifted, heavy and thick, making the lamplight bend ever so slightly. And behind them, in the deeper dark of the trees, something vast moved. Not seen so much as felt, a slow, steady inhalation that seemed to draw the warmth from the night. The twins stopped at the line where dirt road met the cobblestones of the square. They did not smile. They only looked past the townsfolk, past the buildings, past everything, to a point none of the living could see. Mary Coulson took a step toward them, her humming now clearly audible. Jonah followed, then the others, until all the return stood shoulder to shoulder behind the twins. One of the children spoke, a whisper, but it carried across the whole square. "It's ready now." The wind shifted. Somewhere far behind the hills, something began to move. The preacher was the first to understand. His face drained of color, and he gripped the back of a bench so tightly his knuckles went white. It wasn't the words themselves, "It's ready now," but the way the twins had said it, as though they weren't announcing something, but inviting it. The ground beneath the square gave a faint, almost imperceptible shudder, the kind that makes crockery rattle on shelves and loose boards groan. Dogs began to howl, though no one could see where they were. Ellis Ward muttered under his breath. "It's not the cabin anymore," he said, echoing Jonah's earlier words. "It's bigger, older, and it's coming here." At first, people thought he meant the twins had rebuilt the cabin somewhere else, that they were bringing a house down from the hills like some absurd cart. But when the next tremor came, longer this time, accompanied by a deep, wet sound, not footsteps, but roots pulling free from the earth, they understood. The cabin hadn't been a structure at all. It had been a growth, a sprout, and whatever had been pushing it upward had finally broken the surface. From the forest edge, the treetops swayed, though there was no wind. Dark shapes moved between them, their outlines wrong, bending in ways no living thing should bend, their heights shifting as though they were climbing over invisible hills in the air. The twins stood utterly still, waiting. The returned townsfolk leaned forward ever so slightly like flowers turning toward the sun. By the time the third tremor came, strong enough to send dust falling from rooftops, some of the crowd had begun to pray. Others simply closed their eyes, unwilling to see what would break the tree line. The trees didn't fall so much as recede. They drew back in long, shivering motions, trunks bending as though bowing away from something that refused to be touched. The gaps they left were instantly filled by shadow, not the absence of light, but a substance in its own right, thick and slow-moving, seeping forward like a tide. And then it came through. At first it was impossible to tell where it began or ended, a mass of wood and bone and sinew all woven together in impossible angles, like the forest itself had been broken apart and reassembled by something that didn't understand the concept of straight. Windows appeared and disappeared across its surface, some human-sized, some too small for any living thing, and behind each, something watched. The air grew hot and damp, the scent of rot mixing with a faint sweetness, like overripe fruit left in the sun. The cobblestones beneath the twins darkened, moisture spreading outward in a slow ring. It didn't walk. It didn't crawl. It simply advanced, sliding forward as if the ground itself carried it. And as it came, the returned stepped aside without a word, parting to make a perfect path into the heart of the square. Mary Coulson turned back toward the townsfolk, her eyes catching what little light was left. "It's been waiting for you," she said, and this time the cadence of her voice wasn't strange. It was familiar. It was the exact rhythm of the preacher's own sermons. The thing stopped just short of the well, its shifting mass stilled, and in the sudden quiet, the town realized they could hear something from within it, a low, steady knocking, like a hand on a door. Somebody, or something, was asking to be let out. No one moved at first. The knocking continued. 3 slow raps, a pause, then 3 more. It was steady, patient, almost polite, but with each repetition it grew louder, not in volume but in presence, until it seemed to be inside the chest of everyone standing there, vibrating through bone. The preacher stepped forward, holding his Bible like a shield. His lips moved in prayer, but the words faltered when the twins looked at him in unison and shook their heads. "Not you," the boy said softly. "It doesn't want you," the girl added. The crowd shifted uneasily. Eyes darted from one face to another, searching for some unspoken sign, until Jonah Burke stepped out from the returned. He didn't look at anyone, not even his father, who reached out as if to stop him. Jonah simply walked to the edge of the thing, where the wood and bone and shadow met, and placed his palm against it. The surface yielded under his touch, rippling like warm pitch. The knocking stopped. From deep within, something answered him, not in words, but in a low, resonant note that made the air hum. Jonah nodded as though receiving instructions only he could hear. Then he turned to the crowd. "It says we've been locked out," he told them, "and now it's time to come inside." The twins stepped forward to join him, and without hesitation, they pressed their hands to the same place. The surface split open like wet paper, revealing not darkness, but a blinding golden light that smelled faintly of rain on hot stone. For a heartbeat, the town dared to hope. Then they saw the shapes moving in the light, long, thin, and many-jointed, and realized the light wasn't shining. It was feeding. It was Mrs. Felder. She didn't hesitate, didn't glance back at the others, didn't even blink. One moment she was standing in the loose half-circle of townsfolk, the next she was stepping forward, her shadow stretching unnaturally long toward the light. As soon as her foot crossed the threshold, the air shifted, heavy and metallic like the inside of a bell just after it struck. The shapes within the light moved faster, coiling around her legs and waist in delicate, almost tender loops. She didn't struggle. She smiled. The crowd held its breath. Her skin began to glow, not from outside illumination, but as if something beneath it was pushing through. Veins lit with that same gold, hair catching the light as though each strand had been dipped in molten metal. For a moment, she was beautiful. Then she was gone. Not pulled in, not dragged away, simply erased. The coils unwound, the light rippled, and there was no trace of her. Only the faintest whiff of lilacs. Though no flowers bloomed this time of year, Jonah turned back to the crowd, his eyes bright with reflected gold. "She's not lost," he said. "She's home." Mary Coulson took his hand, the twins took hers, and together they looked at the rest of the town. The thing's opening pulsed, slow and expectant. The shapes inside reached just far enough to graze the cobblestones, and deep in every watching heart, something stirred. Not fear, not yet, but a strange, aching curiosity. It happened in waves. First, two farmhands from the northern ridge. They had been whispering to each other since Mrs. Felder vanished, their hands clenched white around their caps. When the light pulsed again, they moved together, shoulders touching, like brothers facing a storm. The coils welcomed them. Next was Ellis Ward, the one who had spoken of the cabin being bigger and older. He didn't walk, he ran, boots striking the stones in a quick, desperate rhythm, as though afraid the light might close before he reached it. He dove through without slowing. Each time someone crossed, the opening widened and the golden scent deepened, sweeter now, with a faint undercurrent of damp earth. The crowd's murmurs grew softer, slower, replaced by that steady hum from within the thing. It worked its way into bones and blood, smoothing out hesitation, replacing it with a subtle pull, like the tide coaxing a boat from its moorings. The preacher fell to his knees. His voice was a rasp, but the words were clear. "If you go, you won't come back." Mary Coulson crouched before him, brushing the hair from his face. Her hand lingered on his cheek, gentle. "That's the point." She rose, turned to the light, and stepped forward. When she vanished, a shiver passed through the crowd, not fear, not exactly, but the cold understanding that the choice was no longer if they would enter. It was Thomas Greer. He hadn't moved at all since the thing arrived, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the ground. If anything, he looked like a man waiting for a storm to pass so he could go back to his chores. The light reached for him anyway. At first, it was subtle, a faint stretching of the golden shapes toward where he stood, curling like vines toward sun. Then, without warning, one of them snapped forward, a whip-crack of brightness that wrapped around his wrist. Thomas jerked back, swearing, but the coil didn't tighten. It pulled. He dug in his heels, boots scraping on stone, but the ground beneath him seemed to lose its solidity, each step sinking a fraction deeper than it should. The crowd didn't move to help, not out of cruelty, but because no one dared to touch the light. Thomas's curses turned into ragged, wordless sounds. His free hand clawed at his sleeve, at the coil, at the air itself. When his eyes met the preacher's, there was no plea, only raw panic. The preacher tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. The light gave one last, almost playful tug, and Thomas slid forward, as though the stones themselves had tilted toward the thing. He vanished past the threshold, and for a split second, they all saw what waited beyond. Not fields, not forests, a vast spiraling expanse of shapes and colors that moved in patterns too complex to follow, like the inside of a shell that had never stopped growing. Then the opening settled again, the scent of lilacs returning, and the crowd exhaled as one. The preacher's breath came shallow, as if the air itself resisted entering his lungs. His hands trembled over the open Bible, pages fluttering though there was no wind. Something was wrong, more wrong than before. He scanned the crowd, counting under his breath. He stopped halfway, brow furrowing, then started again, faster this time. When his lips stilled, his eyes widened. "It's not just taking them," he whispered. "It's replacing them." At first, no one understood, but then they noticed. Near the back, standing half in shadow, were faces they swore hadn't been there minutes ago. Men and women they didn't recognize, wearing the same dull clothes as the townsfolk, their hair hanging damp, their skin faintly luminous. One of them smiled. The teeth were wrong, too even, too many. The twins turned to look at the preacher, their faces utterly calm. "Home has many doors," the boy said. "And sometimes it needs more than it has," the girl added. The strangers began to step forward, moving through the crowd without touching anyone, yet somehow leaving the air colder in their wake. Their eyes never left the golden opening, and with each step they took, the preacher felt the truth settling in his bones like frost. The light wasn't emptying the town, it was filling it. The first word came from a man no one had ever seen before. Tall, gaunt, his damp hair plastered to his skull. His voice was soft but carried cleanly over the square, as if the air bent to deliver it. "You've forgotten the taste of the beginning," he said. Another voice, this one from a woman with glowing eyes and a pale scar curling along her jaw. "You've built walls where there were only paths." The rest joined in, one after another, their words weaving together into something that wasn't quite a chant and wasn't quite a conversation. They spoke of doors that had been sealed, of rivers that had been buried under stone, of a bargain struck long before the town had a name. Each phrase pulled at something in the listeners, not memories exactly, but feelings like déjà vu wrapped in grief. The preacher gripped the Bible tighter. "Don't listen." A replacement stepped close to him, close enough for the gold sheen of its skin to illuminate his face. "We aren't speaking to you," it said gently. "We're speaking to what's underneath." The ground trembled, just enough to rattle the cobblestones. A low sound rose from deep below, the same rhythm as the knocking from inside the thing. The crowd swayed, not from fear, but from an almost drunken pull toward the light. The twins smiled in unison. "It remembers." The first crack was almost delicate, a hairline split threading between the cobblestones, releasing a faint hiss like steam escaping from deep underground. Then the square shuddered. More fissures spread outward, some branching toward the edges of town, others converging directly beneath the golden opening. The air thickened, heavy with that rain-on-hot stone scent, laced now with something sharper, iron or blood. The preacher staggered back as one of the replacements stepped onto the widening crack. Its bare feet didn't sink, didn't stumble. Instead, the stone beneath it melted, softening like wax in fire. From below came a sound, deep and resonant. Not the knock this time, but a slow, deliberate breath. The twins tilted their heads, as if listening to a voice only they could hear. "It's not just the door," the girl murmured. "It's the whole house," the boy said. The fissures widened further, and through them spilled a golden glow, identical to the light in the opening. Except this light moved upward, licking at the air like flame. Shapes darted inside it, too fast to see clearly, their movements jerky, insect-like. The townsfolk pressed closer to the thing, as if the ground itself had become untrustworthy, but the replacements didn't move away from the cracks. They leaned over them, breathing in deeply, their faces slack with something like reverence. One of them looked up, smiling with too many teeth. "It's been waiting under you the whole time." It came slowly at first, as if savoring the moment. Two slender limbs emerged from the largest crack, not arms, not legs, but jointed in too many places, covered in a dark sheen that caught the gold light like wet stone. They flexed against the cobblestones, testing them, before hauling up something that should not have been able to fit through such a narrow space. The replacements stepped back in unison, creating a clear circle around the opening. None of the townsfolk moved closer, but none ran either. The air held them still. The thing's head, if it was a head, rose next, smooth, faceless, but shifting faintly, as though something beneath its surface pressed against it from the inside. The gold light pooled across its skin, making it look carved from molten metal. It paused there, halfway free, and tilted toward the golden opening in the center of the square. The light inside it pulsed in answer, like two creatures greeting each other across a distance. Then, with a sudden liquid motion, it pulled itself fully into the world. Its body was long, narrow, and disturbingly symmetrical, every limb mirrored by another on the opposite side. It moved like both an animal and a mechanism, deliberate, precise, inevitable. The preacher took a step back. His voice cracked. "That's not from it." The twins didn't look at him. "No," the boy said softly. "That's what feeds it," the girl finished, and the thing began to move toward the crowd. It didn't lunge. It selected. The thing's many limbs tapped the stones with delicate precision, each step producing a faint, hollow note, like knuckles rapping on wood. It circled the crowd slowly, its faceless head tilting now and then, as if listening for something beneath the sound of breathing and heartbeats. People tried to lean away when it passed too close, but the air resisted their movement, thick and heavy, as though invisible hands held them in place. It stopped behind Clara Vance, the seamstress. She stood rigid, eyes forward, jaw trembling, the tip of her sewing needle still clutched between her fingers from when she'd been working that morning. One limb reached out, brushing the fabric of her sleeve. The gold light under its surface flared briefly and Clara's breath caught. Not in pain, but in shock, as if she'd heard something whispered directly into her skull. Her face slackened, the needle dropped from her hand. The creature's limbs curled around her, not tightly, just enough to guide her forward. She didn't resist. Her feet moved in time with its steps, both of them turning toward the golden opening in the center of the square. The preacher shouted her name, but the sound barely reached her. At the edge of the light, the creature paused, releasing her. Clara took the final step alone, vanishing into the glow without a sound. The thing lingered there for a moment longer, then turned back to the crowd, limbs unfolding like a blooming flower. It was still hungry. The next chosen would have been Elias Pike, the blacksmith, if not for the sound that split the air, a sharp crack, like ice breaking on a river. All eyes turned toward the far side of the square, where old Mara Hensley stood with her hunting rifle leveled at the creature. She must have run home the moment Thomas was taken, because now she was barefoot, mud streaking her skirts, hair tangled and wild. "You're not taking another," she said. Her voice shook, but her aim did not. The creature froze, head tilting toward her. Its limbs stilled, but the gold light inside it churned faster, brighter, like embers stirred by wind. "Mara," the preacher began. She fired. The shot struck the thing dead center. For a heartbeat, it looked as though nothing had happened. Then the bullet sank into its surface, swallowed by that molten sheen without leaving so much as a mark. The light flared violently, and the sound that followed was not a scream but a deep, resonant chord that rattled every bone in the listeners' bodies. The replacements all turned their heads toward Mara in eerie unison. One of them spoke in a voice that was not its own, deeper, layered, as if multiple throats formed the words together. "You've woken it further." The cobblestones beneath Mara's feet cracked. The cracks under Mara's feet split wide without warning, the stone falling away like brittle glass. She tried to step back, but the ground tilted toward the opening as though gravity itself had shifted. Her rifle clattered across the stones. The crowd watched, rooted in place as something pale and many-fingered reached up from the darkness. Not the same thing that had climbed out earlier, but another presence entirely. Its fingers were impossibly long, jointed in wrong places, the skin stretched thin over shapes that moved beneath it. They didn't seize her. They invited her, curling gently around her legs, waist, and shoulders, pulling her downward with a slow, almost careful insistence. Mara's breath came fast, her eyes wild, but she didn't scream. She only looked at the preacher and mouthed something, too quickly for anyone to read. Then she was gone, pulled below without the faintest splash or thud. The crack sealed shut behind her, the cobblestones knitting together seamlessly, as though nothing had ever broken there at all. The preacher stumbled forward, his voice cracking. "Where does it take them?" The twins turned toward him, their faces perfectly calm. "Not where," the boy said, "but back," the girl finished. The thing in the square resumed moving, as though nothing had interrupted its work. The preacher's hands trembled as he set his Bible down on the stones. For most of the night he had clung to it like a shield, the leather worn smooth by decades of sermons and funerals. Now it felt like a stone tied to his chest, heavy, useless against the thing that moved with patient hunger before him. He stepped out from the crowd. The air was still thick, resisting his every movement, but it let him through. The creature stopped, tilting its faceless head toward him, limbs folding inward like a closing trap. "If it's taking them back," he said, "then take me there too." The replacements shifted, murmurs rippling through their ranks, not disapproval, not surprise, but something like anticipation. The twins smiled. "You'd go willingly?" the boy asked. "Willingly," the preacher replied. The creature approached, each step producing that hollow tapping sound, its limbs unfolding again. The gold light inside it swelled, bathing the preacher in a glow that made his skin look almost transparent. One limb reached out, touching the center of his chest. His breath caught. For a moment, the square vanished from his sight, replaced by a vast dark expanse filled with countless points of light. Not stars, but eyes, watching from a place that felt impossibly far and unbearably near all at once. When the vision faded, he was already standing at the edge of the golden opening. Without looking back, he stepped inside. The preacher vanished into the light, and for a moment the square fell utterly silent. The creature remained still at the edge, limbs poised as if waiting for some signal. Then, deep beneath the cobblestones, the low, resonant breath returned. Slower now, heavier, as though satisfied. The golden opening began to shrink, not quickly, but with the steady, inevitable motion of the tide receding. Its edges darkened first, the brilliance dimming into a dull amber, then into a faint, ember-like glow. The replacements stepped back, their work complete. Some of the townsfolk began to weep. Others stared blankly at the vanishing light, as if unable to believe it could ever be gone. The twins lingered the longest, watching until the final sliver of gold winked out and the stones knit themselves together, erasing every trace of what had stood there. When it was done, the square looked as it had that morning, empty, quiet, and perfectly ordinary. The replacements began to leave, scattering into the streets, their bare feet silent against the stone. No one followed them. In the center of the square, where the door had been, a single object remained, the preacher's Bible, lying closed on the cobblestones. Its cover was warm to the touch. No one dared to pick it up.